Hello, and thanks so much for tuning in to the Scaling People podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and I am so thrilled today to be chatting with Spencer Rascoff. Spencer, I feel like you barely need an intro, but I'll go ahead and do one anyway. Spencer is the epitome of serial entrepreneur and investor. Over the course of his career, he has co-founded several companies that are now household names, including Hotwire, Zillow, and more recently, Pacaso, through which I've gotten to know him and get to work with him. He's also an investor for a number of early stage companies through his VC firm, 75 and Sunny. So it's safe to say he has pretty much seen it all as it relates to scaling successful businesses. And I'm so excited to get into all of that. So Spencer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure working with you, and now it's exciting to be a guest on your podcast.
Totally. And I didn't mention this in your intro, but I also really enjoyed listening to the podcast. You host Office Hours, and so it's nice to have you on the other side of the mic for a change.
Thank you.
Love it. All right, let's get into it. There's so much I want to cover. So to start, Spencer, you've have such a following, and one of the most magnetic things about you is that you've always been known for leading with a people first approach in the companies you started and led, and honestly before it was necessarily the widely accepted best practice. And so I wanted to start by asking where that philosophy came from. Did it seem like it just made sense as you started your first entrepreneurial pursuit at Hotwire, or did you learn the value over time? And why has that been such a core part of your leadership philosophy?
I think it came from being editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper, of all places. So, high school activities are great, and those that provide leadership opportunities are terrific. But most leadership opportunities in high school are, you're in some sort of a hierarchical position relative to your peers. So if you're the captain of the sports team, you're all on the team together, but sort of you're kind of their boss. But the interesting thing about high school newspaper is frequently the editor is managing somebody senior to them. So you'll be like an 11th grade editor in chief, and you're staffing or editing articles for a 12th grader, for example. And so what I learned from that leadership and management responsibility, which was really my first exposure to leadership and management, was that just telling people what to do, just bossing people around does not work. It is demotivating. It doesn't achieve the best outcomes. It's usually counterproductive. And so I adopted very early on this management philosophy of trying to set the goals for the organization and then try to clear roadblocks for your people. So to sort of invert the typical relationship such that the manager works for the direct report rather than the other way around. And that's where that philosophy first came from. And I've carried it through to, I guess now we're 35 years later, 40 years later, I suppose.
I love that.
That's not quite 40 years later. I'm not that old. Sorry, 30 something years later. But anyway, yes, that's where it came from.
I love that. It shows that every leadership opportunity or every just experience is a fundamental building block to how you show up. So it's so cool. Well, at the end of the day, you've been a founder many times and, an investor on the other side of the table. So I'm sure you've used some of your own learnings as you think about the founders that you want to work with or how you'd like to support them. And so in my experience, founders often have a strong vision, but can also develop blind spots when it comes to people management. And so what are some of the common leadership blind spots that you've seen in founders, and how can they or people leaders they work with help overcome them?
Well, you're absolutely right. There are tons of blind spots among founders, especially young founders, with respect to people management. Where to begin? One is around humility. So being a good leader is about being humble and recognizing that other people provide important and diverse perspectives, and that's what helps you achieve better decision making and better outcomes. And so frequently brilliant founders lack humility, they lack coachability, they lack empathy, frequently because they're in such a hurry, because there's such a premium paid for good reason at the early stage on moving fast. Frequently people related matters are left by the wayside. They're perceived to be a waste of time. And in fact, HR people usually aren't even added to organizations until sometimes it's too late and cultures have already been established. But those blind spots that come from founders usually relate to their own arrogance or their speed, and that causes them to dismiss the importance of people, which is of course ironic and unfortunate, because that's all that these early stage companies are, is they're just a collection of these people. There's no brand, there's no product, there's usually not much capital, it's just the people. And so you would expect and you would hope that they would be over investing in people and people development, but usually that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I've heard in the past other founders say that they're really good at a very fine number of things. And that, oftentimes when they get pulled into, this department and what they're working on in the weeds and this thing and that thing, it can be really counterproductive. And so a lot of times, in addition to highlighting the importance of addressing some of the people related issues and challenges, people leaders can also help keep them in their zone of genius, which is, easy to say on the surface, but I think a big piece of that is also supporting them and complementing their skill sets with the other people that they bring onto the team so that, they have those areas covered and then they can kind of, stay in their zone. But yeah, how do you measure all of these things as you're kind of interacting with founders early on, or how do you kind of support them in seeing the value of this work?
Well, a good indicator is one's ability to recruit. So if it's a repeat founder, for example, and they have started a new company where they've reassembled a handful of people from their prior company, that's a pretty good sign. Those are people that are voting with their feet, that are choosing to work with that person again. That's a great indication. I guess other ways that I measure founders' aptitude for people related things, there's just sort of a gut of you get sort of a spidey sense or when you're talking to people, working with people, about whether they care about people, whether they're empathetic, whether they value other people, whether they respect other people's opinions. You can see this in body language. You can see it in whether people cut people off, in whether they're curt with one another, whether they praise in public and criticize in private. These are all things that we learned in kindergarten, and you can see them play out as you watch people interact with other people. Now, it is harder remote.
Mhm.
A lot of these things are easier to ascertain when you're in real life, but that just means that you have to be even more attentive to these issues and try to look for the signs, good and bad, earlier on, and with more energy.
Yeah, totally. I loved how you brought up the concept of servant leadership earlier in our chat. And so that's one aspect of people focused leadership. There's also just like the tangible investment that companies need to make in people and talent. And in some ways, I found recently it's easier to make that investment in a zero interest rate environment when resources are plentiful than it is in a much more constrained macro environment. And so I'm curious what your advice is to companies or other founders that are scaling back and being mindful of their resources as they, manage these wartime environments as it relates to their investment in people and culture. Like, what can you forego, and what would you say is short-sighted to scale back on?
Yeah, it's a tough time to be an HR professional when tech or businesses are contracting. Learning and development tends to get cut. HR business partners tend to get cut. Recruiting obviously gets cut, and so a lot of these things go from, they're perceived. A lot of these cultural aspects that we're discussing here and that you discuss on this podcast go from must have to nice to have real quick. I think the way to overcome it is every executive needs to become an HR professional. Every manager needs to become an HR professional, and the CEO needs to become essentially the CHRO, which they should have been already because that's basically what the CEO is. But everybody needs to be a little bit more engaged and a little bit more involved in these people topics when you have a smaller people staff. The thing that they should try to cut last, if possible, is the HRBP role. Because a good HRBP, a good HR business partner, isn't just managing people out and dealing with negative performance related or inadequate performance related issues. A good HRBP is also helping retain and motivate the best people and getting those 5x people to become 10x people. And so there's actually a lot of leverage in a great HR function, a great HRBP individual, which companies benefit quite a bit from. So I understand why companies are always reluctant to cut back on salespeople or software engineers or perhaps customer support people or marketing budget, because those are all things that very directly relate to revenue and reducing burn. But HR is important too.
Totally, totally. Yeah, I think the trap is usually when the business strategy and the people strategy kind of fork off and become their own separate things. And I love the focus on the HRBP because I think that is really the heart and soul of how, these two pieces come together. And oftentimes the way I've tried to think about it is maybe you're not hiring a lot, so maybe it is okay to de-invest in recruiting. Maybe, you're not necessarily scaling up a ton, and so, you can kind of pull back on some of the aspects of program management related to onboarding, et cetera. But, if you're entering a world where a lot's changing, maybe there isn't an immediate, next month ROI on learning and development. But if you don't do that, like maybe you lose your competitive advantage. And so trying to kind of figure out like what's on your product roadmap, and then how does the people roadmap come together and, help you achieve those goals. So yeah, well, I mean, speaking of that, I do feel like the role of the people leader has evolved so much over the last 5 years, exponentially so. There was COVID and the remote work transition, and then the extreme phase of growth a lot of companies saw, and then the subsequent macro environment that's followed. And hopefully, we're on the verge of coming out of a lot of that. But as you look into the future, especially with AI continuing to reshape the way that we work, how do you see the role of the CPO evolving, and how can people leaders today prepare for that?
Well, I mean, a great people leader is a great partner to the CEO and to the executive team, because great people, properly motivated, build great products, create a lot of revenue, profit, and shareholder value. So it starts with people and their motivations. So when I was running Zillow, I probably spent more time with Dan Spalding, the CHRO, than any other executive. I mean, it was somebody that I was I was very synced with, and he was very connected with where we were going as a company and what I was focused on as CEO. So, and AI is not going to change that. I mean, there's no AI that does that. AI is going to change a lot about how companies operate and how software code gets written, how customer support gets delivered, and how marketing initiatives get executed. But the people leader, the people function, and its partnership with the CEO and the executive team, I don't see that being changed by technology at all.
Yeah, for sure. I guess on the just with AI, playing a role in how, employees' roles are going to change and how companies operate, are there any ways in which you see how the CPOs sort of focus, or some of the things that they're going to be working, their other execs or team members will adapt, or you think it'll pretty much be very similar to how they operate today?
I think it'll be quite very similar. The main difference is every employee is going to be using AI to do their job, just like we use the internet to do our job.
Hmm.
I mean, there were companies before there was a web browser, and it's hard to imagine doing our jobs today without the internet, but it used to happen. And there were huge companies that were created in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s without internet access. And so every employee will use AI just like every employee uses the internet. That will make every employee, I don't know, 10%, 20%, 50%, maybe 100%, depending on their function, more productive, just like the internet has made us so much more productive. Then can you imagine how long it would take us to do our jobs today without the internet 30 years ago? And then there will also be some autonomous AI related quote unquote employees who aren't really employees, but it's basically software
Hmm.
that is doing certain functions. Those may be anthropomorphized, where it's like, oh, there's Joe AI and he's an employee that's in customer support, in which case maybe it ends up somehow in the people function, kind of, they're like the corporation would use an outsourced AI vendor that would spin up, say, 20 quote unquote employees that will do whatever the function is. And HR function would have to think of those AIs like we think about regular employees in some ways. Or I think more likely, they won't be anthropomorphized, and instead it'll just be like software today,
Hmm.
where there already is plenty of software that does things around the company, like think, for example, the auto posts in Slack. So at Pacaso, every time we sell a Pacaso unit, there's an automatic post that happens somehow magically through software in Slack.
Hmm.
Well, 30 years ago, if we had been around then, that kind of ringing of the bell every time there's a sale might have been done by a human. Now it's done by software. And so we're going to see things like that throughout organizations. I don't think those really have any implication on the HR function. That'll just be software. And so to answer your question directly, I don't think the AI function is going to change the role of the people function all that much.
Mhm.
It's just going to mean that there'll be a lot more software in these organizations and everyone will be more productive and move a lot faster. Maybe that will introduce new complexity,
Mhm.
which will make it a little bit harder to manage organizations because, if you just think about like how time has changed, it feels like everything's on warp speed today.
Right.
And what companies are able to accomplish in 3 months, they used to do in 3 years, they used to do in 13 years. Well, roll this tape forward 5 years, and companies are going to be doing things in days or hours that it would otherwise have taken them weeks, months, or years. And so that will make companies more complex, and that burden will fall on the people function
Yeah, for
to help
sure.
manage that complexity.
Yeah, every time I think about how AI is going to change businesses, I think it's much easier for me sometimes to think about what the world will look like in 10 years than what the world will look like in 1 year or 2 years. And I think the HR leaders that are more attuned to what's going to happen in that 1 or 2 year time period are going to have that competitive advantage. I think to your point on, these anthropomorphic employees, the other thing I sometimes think about is what are the headcount sizes that we're going to be managing? Like, are there going to be more unicorn companies that are 10 people, 20 people? Are employees just going to kind of reskill and have impact in a different way? So that's another dynamic.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's an excellent point, and I agree with you. Companies are doing much more with less. I asked a company the other day that had 350 employees. It was a unicorn, and I said, how much are you using AI in your organization today? And he said, a decent amount. And he ticked through, software engineers are using it to write code, and we're doing some of our testing with it, and the marketing people are using it to write copy, and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, okay, if you were starting the company over today, how many employees do you think you'd end up with? Presumably you would have baked AI into every function at the company. And instead of 350, his answer was about 100.
Mm-hmm.
And then I asked another founder of another unicorn, he's also about 300 employees. I said, how much are you using AI in your organization? He said, tons. And he went through and it was like everywhere. And I said, well, hasn't it reduced your headcount? He said, if it were not for that, not for the rampant use of AI, we would be at 600 employees
Mm-hmm.
today. So basically we've been able to keep it flat even as the business has quadrupled over the last couple of years because of AI. So anyway, those are two different examples where all signs point to less headcount,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
less headcount per market cap or less headcount per revenue because of the use of software. I mean, that's scary for our economy and our society. It's not so great for HR professionals either, I suppose, which also sort of scale based on headcount. But it's good for productivity. It's good for economic output. It's good for GDP. It's good for a lot of things. And what we've seen through other inventions and other periods of technological progress is it works itself out,
Right.
around headcount, and it's like people get reskilled, or
Right.
or
Exactly.
companies do end up hiring more people, just doing different things. And so, I mean, I'm pretty optimistic societally that that's where we'll end up. I know the podcast is meant to focus on the HR function, not societal implications of technical advances. But since you
Yeah,
asked.
I love it. Yeah, I think the people that are going to, fare the best are the ones that are going to learn to work with all of these new innovations. There was at a HR conference I was at, a few weeks ago, there was this discussion on a lot of these AI based, manager development tools where they would interface directly with employees and kind of give them feedback on how they can better lead. And, the discussion was around how, sometimes you see resistance to these tools because there is this idea of like, well, then like, what are my HR BPs going to do? And the reality is like, these tools are going to, continue to deliver value and companies are going to use them. And so finding a way to understand how to work with them and differentiate your value, I think is ultimately what's going to set the HR space to be innovators and lead. So it's obvious the CPO role is continuing to be more and more complex as the way that we work and the world around us also continues to evolve. And so I'm curious, how do you think CPOs can move beyond being seen as just people leaders and into true strategic business partners? Like, what's stopping more companies from giving their CPOs a seat at the table when making major business decisions or adding CPOs to their boardroom?
Well, first we have a slight branding problem because the chief product officer, I think, has seized the CPO title. So I think you have to. I don't know if it's CHRO or you want to arm wrestle with the product people and try to win back CPO. But maybe in the world you live in every day, CPO means people. But I think most execs, when they hear CPO, they think chief product officer. So that's the first problem. But putting aside that, that issue, the way to do it, I think, is through the CEO. It's through appealing to the CEO and convincing her or him that the people function is a revenue center, not a cost center, that it can drive better business outcomes, not just risk mitigate, that it's not just about getting rid of underperforming people and trying to do it in a way that reduces litigation risk as we kick people out the door, which is the way most people think of the HR function, sadly. So that starts and ends with the CEO. So convincing the CEO of that, and maybe also, telling the stories of companies who do put people first. So I think this founder mode debate over the last couple of weeks in tech, which I'm sure you've been following, is pretty interesting because Paul Graham wrote this blog post about founder mode, and in it he describes in his view, the best type of leader is a CEO founder who is super hands-on and is, one might call, a micromanager. And it's personified by Elon Musk as sort of the archetype, who is in every meeting, a little bit dictatorial, short with people, and makes decisions quickly based on his or her instinct, and isn't particularly collaborative. And the argument is that in wartime, that's the best type of leader. And I don't really share that view. Maybe I think that does make me an outlier in tech, because the pendulum has sort of swung in favor of that, which is, I think, why Paul Graham wrote that post. And maybe I'm summarizing it unfairly and inaccurately, and that's part of, and I'll take that criticism if it's fair. But your question was, how can people leaders get more of a seat at the table? I think the answer is pointing to examples of companies that put people first. The
Mhm.
Zillow culture is one of them, which has been a successful tech company that was well run and was a people first organization. It is well run and is a people first organization. And trying to counter the narrative of this, the Elon Muskization of walking into Twitter, nuking 80% of the people, and people believing that that's the best way to lead. So
Mhm.
that is a really dangerous narrative to the people function. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think to your point around the branding issue, I know this is like a slightly different take on that, but I also think like if you look at the history of how where HR teams have focused, it wasn't really a strategic function for a very long time. And so I think it does take time for that reputation and that narrative to evolve. And I think a lot of times I think like we can be that change by better understanding the businesses that we work for. Like, how do they make money? What are our competitors doing? Like, how can we then use that knowledge to then influence people related decisions and show up as business leaders just as much as we kind of think about like the ethos of the culture and how we work, but be contribute to how we think about operating the business, just as the CFO thinks about it, or just as your chief product officer thinks about it. But kind of switching gears and putting your investor hat on, you constantly have your finger on the pulse of the future of work. And so I'm curious, what trends are you watching closely, specifically as it relates to HR tech? And where do you see the biggest opportunities for solutions to be developed? Or what are the tools you're most excited about that are already out there or waiting for to be built?
well, I mean, I think the biggest problem that has not yet been solved in HR tech is this remote hybrid work and
Mm-hmm.
communication, motivation, collaboration, and a couple other Asians, which is very difficult in remote organizations. And there are software solutions that are trying to solve this problem. Slack is an obvious one that's already a big mature company, but there are many other smaller companies, and I've invested in some of them. Companies like Guide, which do employee onboarding for remote workers, Kona, which I know you're familiar with, Ruska, which does employee education and employee basically EQ training for remote managers. So I mean, this is a big problem. There are huge advantages to remote work and to being a remote first company, including the ability to hire great people quickly, the ability to retain people by providing them with that flexibility. But there are huge disadvantages, and collaboration and coordination and communication are the most obvious ones. So I I do not think we've solved that problem. And I think there's going to be a lot more HR tech applied to that to try to address that. Other problems in HR, in the HR world are I guess they're sort of related to this gig economy world that we're living in, which is
Hmm.
still a pretty new phenomenon. But the idea of people having one full-time job where they're on payroll from ADP and they get, they have their Social Security and Medicare deducted, and they get that every 2-week direct deposit, and that's it. Like, that
Hmm.
is not really the world that we live in 2024, and definitely won't be 5 years from now. Most people have a side hustle of some sort. Many people have multiple jobs. Software engineers also get gigs on Upwork. People do things on TaskRabbit. Like, there's just lots of gig economy things that supplement income, and people do podcasts. um, and so there's a lot of HR solutions that need to be applied to that mode of working, whether it be taxes or billing, invoicing, time management, tracking of these different projects across different jobs and channels. Like, that is a whole new frontier. And there already are point solutions to a lot of these things, but I think it's becoming a bigger problem as more people start to work that way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm so interested to see how the world of work is going to continue to evolve. But Spencer, as always, thank you so much for coming on and sharing such valuable insights as always. And it's just, so great to see how the future of HR and leadership will continue to adapt and change. So I'm excited to see how it all
Thank you
materializes.
for
Until
calling
next time.
attention to these important issues. I'm appreciative that you're doing so. Thanks for the conversation.